Hey, y'all, I'm Bud Elliott, and this is my college football summer school series on Cover 3. I bring on the team experts from the 24/7 sports staff and ask them the questions I care about. No fluff. Which players will be toughest to replace? What position groups are sneakily better or worse than I realize? We get you the scoop on each team in 20 minutes or less. Let's go. Hey, guys, welcome back to Bud Elliott's College Football Summer School on the Cover 3 podcast. I'm Bud Elliott. That's Jeff Hansen, and that means today we are talking BYU. Jeff Hansen of CougarSportsInsider. Jeff, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Bud. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So a really exciting time for BYU sports. Last year, 8-5, kind of came out like in the 70s, some people in the 60s in most of the national power ratings. And now they move on to the Big 12. This is a really, it's got to be an interesting time to cover these guys.
It is, man. I mean, there's a lot of really exciting things, obviously, across the program. I mean, just that transition from an independent program into the Power 5 conferences, that's a big deal. That's a big deal for any school. But even if you get beyond that and get into the micro a little bit, BYU had a big defensive coordinator change, right? I mean, that's exciting. If you go through any of the power rankings, it's usually the defense over the last few years that's held BYU back. They bring in defensive coordinator Jay Hill, former Weber State head coach, who out west is regarded as one of the brightest minds in football. And he's done a lot of things to really kind of, I guess, capitalize on the excitement of the Big 12 and also give his own level of excitement for a new defensive scheme. A lot of fans are excited to see what BYU can do this year.
No doubt. So let's go ahead and start on that side of the ball then. 95th in the country last year, and I'll just use Bill Connolly's power rating, right, for defensive power rating. They were bend but don't break to the max, but then they also broke, which, I mean, if you're 95th, that's got to be kind of both. They do lose, at least by the numbers, their best linebacker and best corner to Tennessee, but they've taken on a lot of transfers here. Can you sort of just start by walking me through which of these transfers will play and which of these transfers might be more depth and where do you feel they've hit and maybe not hit?
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it on the head. Bend but don't break. But if you break, it doesn't really matter, right? It can quickly become death by 1,000 paper cuts when that's your philosophy. So BYU needed to shore up tackling, and that was one of the biggest problems. I mean, their scheme was vanilla. They didn't get after the pass rusher. They played a lot of coverage. But when you don't tackle, that doesn't work. So the first, I guess the biggest impact transfer that BYU has added is Utah State linebacker AJ Vongphachon. He comes in. He's got 3 years of starting experience at Utah State. He was their leading tackler for a couple of those years. He's going to probably immediately start in the middle of BYU's defense alongside Ben Bywater and Max Tooley. That goes a big way in helping BYU shore up their tackling, but really their run defense, right? BYU also has not had a pass rush really at all to speak of over the last couple of years. They go out and they add Isaiah Bagna from Boise State, who, when he's healthy, he's been a pretty productive pass rusher. He's struggled with health. He struggled to stay on the field for 12 games, but when he's on the field, he's electric. And BYU was hoping that with the mindset change in their philosophy and players like Bagna, they can get after the quarterback and create a little bit more havoc than they have in years past. And then beyond that, Jackson Cravens and Eddie Heckard are two transfers who are probably going to play right away, probably in the starting lineup on day one. Everybody on the defensive side of the ball that's transferred in, aside from those four, is probably more of a depth play, but those four, BYU is looking at them to come in and make immediate contributions.
You mentioned a new mindset and the Boise State transfer, if healthy. Is that a mindset of like more blitzing, let playing less coverage, or just kind of a mentality?
Yeah, a little bit of both, right? I mean, no more two gapping, no more stuffing and trying to eat up blockers and let somebody else make a play. Jay Hill's come in and he wants to shoot gaps. He wants to make plays. He wants to send blitzes. He's from the Kyle Whittingham coaching tree. And when you look at what his defenses did at Weber State, it's very similar to what Kyle Whittingham's defenses have done at Utah over the last 10 or 15 years. So you put Jay Hill with Kalani Sitake, who's also from that coaching tree, and there's a lot of aggressive nature and aggressive thinking in that film room, and I think that's what BYU is hoping to see come to light this fall.
Jeff, I watched a lot of BYU last year, and maybe it was just because of they're on a lot on national TV, and they also play a decent number of weeknight games. I think it was East Carolina and maybe the maybe Utah State game as well. And I agree with you about the tackling. I also thought the defensive line was was relatively handled by some,
Yeah.
some opposing offensive lines that I don't think are like, I definitely didn't think Utah State's O line was great. And,
Hmm.
East Carolina, I guess they had two good players, but I just didn't think of them as amazing. Do you see improvement on the defensive line this year in terms of like handling blocks?
I, I do, but I mean, when you're as bad as BYU was, that's not a huge bar to clear.
Sure.
They were bad. They got handled by just about every offensive line except for Baylor. Weirdly, that Baylor's one of the best offensive lines in the country, and BYU had their way. So that was a little strange. The talent is just not there on the defensive line. There's a lot of walk-ons that play, which is great, right? I mean, everybody hopes that you have that walk-on story, but when you're depending on walk-ons to make that immediate contribution, then you've done something really wrong on the recruiting trail with your scholarships. And so the depth isn't there. A lot of walk-ons, a lot of former offensive linemen who have flipped over to the defensive side of the ball, a lot of just kind of learning on the fly. And the coaching, I don't think the coaching was what it needed to be. BYU has added Sione Puha, who is kind of a proven coach, former NFL guy, did some really good things at Utah when he was on their staff. So I think that the improvement will be there, but I think that BYU's defensive line is still a few years away from having the talent that they need to be a good defensive line, but they shouldn't be as bad as they were a year ago.
Yeah, I also feel like this, and this is just, I don't have the data on this. So I apologize. This defense feels like it got wrecked with injuries a good bit
Yeah.
last year. What spots do we think just with average health could get better, especially in the secondary? You lose Gabe Giuliani, but like, weren't they playing a bunch of backups in the secondary at one point?
They were, and some of that was injury. BYU did get hit hard with injury, and some of that was just kind of the weird philosophy that the coaching staff has. And there's really not a way to sugarcoat it, Bud. They liked hockey subs. I mean, BYU was one of the only teams I've ever seen that would have full on line shifts where you're seeing 10 subs come on at the same time. It was weird to watch. And so you had a lot of new faces. You didn't have a lot of camaraderie, and then you throw in an injury or two each week. And there's just not a lot of chemistry with the guys that are out there on the field. BYU did replace their strength and conditioning staff this year. So clearly Kalani Sitake sees a need to get healthier, right? And to do something different. They, doing a lot less powerlifting, a lot more flexibility, a lot more speed training, stuff like that. More of a modernization of their strength and conditioning program. So they're hoping that will lead to fewer injuries. But even beyond that, I mean, just having your best 11 on the field as much as you can without trying to play your entire two deep, almost like it's little league football. I think that should help with some of the chemistries and some of those issues that you would see on the field for BYU.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Let's go ahead and switch over to the offense here. Finished up 52nd in Connolly stuff. I feel like when they were healthy, it was certainly better than that. But like, to me, Hall looked hurt for a good part of the year. I know they never came out and said it, but I forgot what game it was. It was like, it looks like he took a shot.
Yeah.
And was not right after that.
Yeah, he clearly got hurt. It was towards the beginning of the year, but there were games, the Notre Dame game, where he couldn't throw a football in the first half. And it looked like maybe he got his, Toradol shot like right before kickoff, and his arm was numb in the first half. And it finally kicked in the second half, and he looked a little bit more like Jaron Hall. But yeah, I think you're spot on. He was noticeably hurt for a few games in the season, and I think that played a big role. As he got healthier as the year went on, he ultimately got hurt against Stanford at the end of the year. But when he was healthier there at the end, that offense started to click a little bit more. Injuries played a huge role. I mean, it really was a big role. The wide receivers, it was kind of a revolving door of who was healthy there. Running backs were in and out. So injuries played a big role, especially on the offense, but especially with the quarterback, Jaron Hall.
What have you seen out of Pitt transfer and former USC transfer Kedon Slovis? I mean, a guy who's not as mobile as Hall was, but how did he look in the spring?
The coaches love him. They are raving about what he did during the spring. He looks comfortable. He looks like he's having fun. And I don't know how much of Pitt you got to see last year, but Kedon Slovis did not look like he was enjoying football anymore. I mean, things were just, I don't know if he was thinking too much or if it was just a new offense and he had to process slow. I don't know what it was, but he never really looked comfortable and he never really looked like he was enjoying himself. Throughout spring ball, the Kedon Slovis that's been at BYU looks a lot like that Kedon Slovis that we saw at USC. He's quick with his decision making. He's been accurate. And the guy's happy when he comes off the field, and the results look tangibly different than what we saw from him at Pitt last year. So I know that Coach Aaron Roderick, the offensive coordinator, he raves about Kedon Slovis. He's talking about him the same way that he talked about Zach Wilson and Jaron Hall. And so I know that there's a lot of excitement from the coaching staff. And from what we've seen as fans and in the media, there's those like the glimmer of hope that, yeah, hey, look, this looks bright. This looks promising. Obviously, I haven't seen enough of a sample size to jump fully on that bandwagon yet. But the signs are there that Kedon Slovis could have a big year.
That makes sense. I mean, look, Jordan Addison left Pitt for a reason, and I don't think it was all NIL. They had a guy in Kenny Pickett, like a Heisman finalist, and then the head coach is up there talking about how they need to run the ball a lot more. Like,
right?
Did you see like just how much success you had? Your Pitt, and you went to the Peach Bowl. Like that's pretty good.
Right.
So I get it. Not exactly a super quarterback friendly system they were running there in Pittsburgh, and he was air raid back at USC. And I know in high school he threw the ball a ton.
Yeah.
In that final year, so that makes sense if he's chucking around a little more. Still, a run game is a quarterback's best friend if you got it. They lose Chris Brooks. They lose Jaron Hall, who was fairly effective on the ground, and a couple other backs as well. Should I be concerned about this room?
BYU's coaching staff feels good. I think they added UNLV transfer Aiden Robbins, and Aiden Robbins can play. BYU wanted him out of high school. He ultimately ended up at Louisville, and then he transferred to UNLV before last season. He ran for 1,000 yards at UNLV, and I get it. They're playing in the Mountain West. It's a different ball game, but he was playing behind a Mountain West offensive line, and he was clearly the best and not even a good Mountain West offensive line at that. And he was clearly the best running back on the field. I mean, he was the best player most of the time for UNLV. So he comes into the mix. BYU likes him. They like him in their wide zone scheme. They like him behind their big offensive tackles and Caleb Etienne and Kingsley Suamataia. So there's reason to be hopeful that Aiden Robbins can come in and really pick up where Chris Brooks left off or where Tyler Algier left off. Behind him, there's talent in the room. They flipped a commit from Stanford, LJ Martin out of Texas on signing day. If he wasn't a 4-star, he was right close to 4-star. So there's a lot of hope for him. Hinkley Ropati kind of came on late last year. So there's not a lot of proven experience, but there's 2 or 3 guys that BYU feels pretty comfortable with. Obviously, they got to show it on the field, and it's different when the lights are on Saturday nights. But BYU feels confident in those guys behind Robbins, and they feel really good about Aiden Robbins.
Have they run any Wildcat with I forget the kid's name, but like he didn't look, as he's assuming he's still on the roster. The quarterback they had in the bowl game was a pretty good runner.
He was. In fact, they immediately after the bowl game moved him from quarterback to running back to find a way to get him the ball more. So Soljay Mayava Peters, he will be. He'll be a factor. I think BYU will kind of use him in a variety of roles because he can actually catch the ball a little bit as well. So maybe they put him in the slot. Maybe they line him out back, and he can throw the ball enough that he can be a threat. So they want to find ways to get him on the field. I don't think he showed enough to be, the quarterback or the guy there, but he was dynamic when he had the ball in his hands.
Absolutely. So switching over to receiver here, I feel like a lot of these names that BYU lost are lost more in name recognition value than they are in on-field value. But Puka, when he was on the field, he was a stud. And I know he didn't stay totally healthy last year, but he's gone. Cody Epps is gone. Romney's gone, but he barely played.
Right.
This looks like a step back here, right?
Well, it does. Cody Epps actually, he left and then came back. It was kind of a wild transfer portal win for BYU. So it doesn't, count in the rankings, but it's a win for Kalani Sitake. But you're right about Gunnar Romney that it hurts. He was a guy who, when Zach Wilson was here, he was a big part of the offense, but Zach's been gone for a long time and Gunnar really hasn't been a part of the offense since. There's a lot of names. There's a lot of names that you hope step up. BYU feels pretty good about 3 of their receivers, one being Epps, Chase Roberts, and Keanu Hill. They're all kind of like wide receiver 2s. Like you hope one of them steps up and becomes that guy like Puka Nacua was when he was on the field. They're all pretty good wide receiver 2s, but they're all wide receiver 2s. They've added Eastern Michigan wide receiver Darius Lassiter out of the transfer portal. He kind of feels a lot like those other 3 that maybe he could be a really good second option. I just don't know if there's anybody right now that really clearly stands out as like, hey, you're going to take on the best cornerback every single week and you're going to be able to create space every single week. I don't know if they have that guy. So how they how they find out how to use these 4 wide receivers so that somebody's getting open each week, that's going to be the biggest challenge. And then behind them, the depth is really young. It's really inexperienced. It's just not there. There's hope for the future with those players, but a lot of freshmen that just haven't played. JoJo Phillips is coming out of high school, out of the state of California. BYU is really high on him, and I think that's probably the closest thing to a sure thing that you have is a true freshman out of high school, a 3-star guy. So I wouldn't be surprised to see BYU add another body or 2 before fall camp starts out of the transfer portal at the wide receiver position. But I just don't think the talent is there right now for BYU that they can go out and add a wide receiver 1. I think those guys have all been gobbled up by other schools across the country.
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 guys right now that I would think of in the portal, and it's it's Coleman from Michigan State and maybe Franklin from UTSA, and they're both going to be like national championship, most likely like contender type offers. It's a tough spot to fill this late if you need a true receiver 1. So offensive line, I like Kingsley a lot. He's a super talented dude, and they didn't lose much, right? Like you lose Clark Barrington and his brother or cousin to Baylor, but that Campbell Barrington basically didn't play.
Right.
And yet BYU took 5 offensive linemen. Is that like should I see alarm bells going off if they don't like what they have in that room? Because like taking 5 transfer linemen is a lot.
That is a lot. I think some historical context from Kalani Sitake's first couple of years when he was at BYU, they had 4 or 5 really good offensive linemen, and when there was an injury, man, things just plummeted. They got bad. That 2017 year was awful. And a lot of it was the health of the offensive line. Since then, and since bringing in Jeff Grimes to be the offensive coordinator in 2018, Kalani Sitake has erred on the side of, I want 15 offensive linemen who can play. And so I think that's what you're seeing right now. They feel really good about this offensive line, but they really like to have 10 starting caliber offensive linemen if they can. So they feel really good. They feel like in fact, Aaron Roderick talked about it, that even losing a guy like Blake Freeland to the NFL, the Barrington brothers to Baylor, he feels that they got more athletic and more deep this year than they were even a year ago. And they've played pretty well for the last couple of years. So Kingsley's a stud. As long as you have a left tackle like Kingsley, you're going to feel pretty comfortable going into the season. But even behind him, BYU feels really good about 8 or 9 guys. They're hoping a couple more step up.
So maybe not as much upside, but certainly like if they get injured, like it's not going to kill the team because you have some guys that can play. That's certainly comforting. I think the Big 12 schedule this year, when you're trying to figure out the pecking order, is really important. And dude, BYU does not draw a favorable Big 12 schedule for their first year. They have to play. In my top 4 teams are Texas, OU, Kansas State, TCU in some order. They get 3 of those 4,
right?
And then they also have to go play. They miss Baylor, right? But they all Texas Tech is at least you get Texas Tech to come to Provo and not have to go to Lubbock. They have a trip to Arkansas and a trip to an improving Kansas team. This is kind of a brutal schedule for.
It is. It gets tough. They do get, I think, a reasonably favorable home schedule. Not that they're getting their biggest names at home. They do get OU at home, but it looks like they should be able to take care of business with night games in Provo. You get Iowa State, you get Cincinnati, obviously the 2 non-conference games at the beginning of the year. I think their over-under is at 6 wins, and it feels like there are 4 wins that you feel really, really comfortable with going into the season. And then there's a handful of toss-up games. But then, yeah, you're right, Bud. I mean, they're one of 2 Big 12 teams who has to play both Texas and OU, and it's their first year in the conference. They didn't get a whole lot of favors there, but frankly, I think BYU would prefer it that way, given what they've tried to do with their independent scheduling. They've tried to load up and play as many as they can. So I think they're more prepared than maybe some of these schools coming out of the American to play a really tough schedule like this. But that doesn't make it any easier to actually play that schedule.
Well, at least they attack the transfer portal hard, and like you mentioned, they have been road warriors before. The trip all the way to Morgantown is certainly a long trip, and they did clip Oklahoma last year. That's an interesting over/under for this team. It's always tough to project how they're going to do when they come into a new league because it's the first time they've seen everybody, but it's also the first time everybody has seen them. So it's hard to tell.
Yeah.
Jeff, I really appreciate the time here today, man. This has been great, and I feel like I've really gone to school on BYU. Anything we missed that you feel like I can't believe this dummy didn't ask me about?
No, man. I mean, I think you covered it. I think that the biggest thing, I mean, if there's one takeaway, really anything you've seen from the BYU defense, you can kind of throw it away from the last 2 years. And that's BYU's biggest advantage, I think, is that unknown going into the season. I mean, just anytime there's a new defensive coordinator, there's unknown. But BYU's doing more than just replacing a defensive scheme. I mean, it's talent, it's philosophy. They've had kind of their own miniature Colorado transfer portal exodus on the defensive side of the ball, where this new staff came in and said, look, this isn't going to get it done. We've got to get some guys out and we got to bring some other guys in. So the defense, I mean, the whole all of BYU fans are anxiously awaiting to see what it looks like. But I think really any college football fan could look at that and say, hey, Jay Hill, if he's as good as we think he is, the BYU defense could make a quick turnaround and be a lot of fun to watch this year.
No doubt about it. Jeff Hansen, Cougar Insider, Cougar Insider, Cougar Sports Insider, excuse me. Last one of the day. We've done 11 of these. Jeff, I really appreciate the time.
Appreciate it, Bud. Thanks so much.